Behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me, to render to every man according to what he has done. These words from Revelation 22:12 have echoed through centuries, but never have they resonated with such clarity as they do today. The ancient prophets weren't just speaking to their time, they were speaking to ours. In 2025, we've witnessed the precise fulfillment of prophecies written millennia ago. The siege of Jerusalem, the roaring of the seas, the kings of the East preparing for war. These aren't coincidences. They're divine coordinates on God's prophetic timeline. I've spent decades studying these patterns, and what I've discovered about 2026 will shake you to your core. 10 biblical prophecies are converging next year with mathematical precision. The cosmic clock is about to strike midnight, and most people have no idea what's coming. Look around you. The world is changing at a pace that defies explanation. Nations that stood strong for centuries now tremble. Weather patterns that remained stable for millennia now convulse with unprecedented fury. The moral fabric that held society together is unraveling before our eyes. But what if I told you none of this is random? What if every headline, every crisis, every moment of chaos is following a script written thousands of years ago? The Bible isn't just a religious text. It's a prophetic roadmap. And in 2025, we've reached the final junction before the destination. On October 13, 2025, Russia's Dmitry Medvedev issued a warning that sent chills through the West. If the United States sends Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, we won't distinguish whether they're nuclear or conventional. Our response will be on the same level. The world stood at the precipice of nuclear annihilation, exactly as Jesus foretold when he spoke of wars and rumors of wars. In July 2025, Israel faced attacks from 5 fronts simultaneously: Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Yemen. The prophet Zechariah wrote it 2,500 years ago. Jerusalem will become a cup of trembling for all nations. But these events aren't isolated incidents. They're pieces of a divine puzzle that's reaching completion. And the final picture reveals something stunning about 2026. God's mathematics are perfect. The Apostle Peter left us a key. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. If we apply this pattern to history, 4,000 years, represented as 4 days, passed from Adam to Jesus. Another 2,000 years, 2 days, have passed from Jesus until today. That's 6,000 years. We're in the final minutes of the 6th day. The cosmic clock is about to strike the end of the human era and usher in the 7th millennium, the kingdom of Christ. And nearly every biblical timeline points to this countdown ending somewhere between 2025 and 2030. But why 2026 specifically? What makes next year the critical turning point? The answer lies in the convergence of 10 specific prophecies that began unfolding in 2025 and will reach their climax in 2026. These aren't vague predictions. They're precise descriptions of events we're witnessing right now, from the waters of the South China Sea to the burning skies over Los Angeles, from the blood-soaked streets of Myanmar to the trembling walls of Damascus. The Bible foretold it all, and what comes next will leave you speechless. In the next hour, I'll walk you through each of these 10 prophecies. I'll show you exactly what the Bible predicted, how it's being fulfilled before our eyes, and what it means for 2000. You'll see dates, statistics, and events that cannot be explained away as coincidence. But I must warn you, this isn't information for the faint of heart. Once you understand the prophetic timeline we're on, you'll never see the world the same way again. You'll recognize the signs that others miss. You'll understand why certain nations are aligning against others. You'll know why natural disasters are intensifying in specific regions. Most importantly, you'll understand why 2026 isn't just another year on the calendar. It's the year everything changes. Are you ready to see what the prophets saw? Are you prepared to understand the times we're living in? The countdown has begun, and it starts with prophecy number 10, a prophecy about Jerusalem that's unfolding right now in ways that would have seemed impossible just months ago. What happens when the entire world turns against one tiny nation? And why did God call Jerusalem a cup of trembling thousands of years before it became the epicenter of global conflict? The answer will change everything you thought you knew about current events. Prophecy 10, Zechariah 12, Jerusalem, a cup of trembling. What many feared has finally happened. In June 2025, Israel launched a simultaneous devastating offensive against Iran, Gaza, and Lebanon. But this time, the world said enough. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Turkey condemned. Iran mobilized. The UN demanded immediate investigations. But the most shocking part played out in the streets. From London and Paris to New York, thousands of people called for sanctions against Israel. This was no longer a regional conflict. It became the entire world against one country. But this was written in the Bible. Zechariah 12:2-3 tells us, "I will make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. All the nations of the earth will be gathered against her. All who try to move her will be cut to pieces. A cup that knocks nations off balance. A cup that makes them tremble. A cup that wounds anyone who tries to move it." That is Israel in 2025. In March 2025, Israel launched Operation Power and Sword against Hamas, breaking a fragile ceasefire that barely lasted a few weeks. On the night of March 18th, bombs rained down on Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah. Within days, the death toll surpassed 400 Palestinians, including women and children. Ground troops advanced and seized the Netzarim corridor, splitting Gaza in two. Thousands of buildings were reduced to rubble. Hospitals collapsed. October arrived, and with it, a new attempt at peace. On the 10th, the United States managed to negotiate another ceasefire. Israel withdrew its troops. Humanitarian aid was allowed in. It seemed like a moment to breathe, but it only lasted 9 days. On October 19th, the truce shattered. Hamas launched an attack in Rafah. 2 Israeli soldiers were killed, Major Levy, 26 years old, and Sergeant Etz, just 21. Israel's response was immediate. Massive airstrikes. 44 Palestinians died that same day. 97 since the beginning of the month, with 230 wounded. The Rafah crossing closed. Humanitarian aid came to a halt once again. Hamas denied responsibility. Israel accused them of betraying the agreement. Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered a forceful response. And this is where the world reacted. But not just with words. They responded with diplomatic pressure, with UN resolutions of condemnation, with thousands of people protesting in the streets of London, Paris, and New York. What we're witnessing is a modern-day siege against Israel. One that isn't being fought only on the battlefield. It's a siege waged through media, politics, and global opinion. Think about this. On November 3, 2025, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 80-157, condemning Israel's actions in Gaza. The vote was unprecedented. 143 nations in favor, 9 against, with 27 abstentions. Never before had Israel faced such unified global opposition. Even traditional allies began to waver. The European Union imposed partial sanctions on Israeli products from disputed territories. Canada recalled its ambassador. Australia suspended military cooperation. And in the United States, massive protests erupted on college campuses across the country, with students demanding their universities divest from Israeli companies. This isn't normal politics. This is prophecy unfolding before our eyes. Notice the precision of Zechariah's words. All the nations of the earth will be gathered against her. Not some nations, not most nations, all nations. We're watching this happen in real time. But there's something even more chilling in this prophecy. Zechariah continues, "On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations." all who try to move it will injure themselves. Despite facing global opposition, Israel has not backed down. In fact, on December 1, 2025, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced the construction of 5,000 new housing units in East Jerusalem, a direct challenge to international pressure. The more the world pushes, the more Israel resists. This is exactly what the prophecy describes, an immovable rock that injures those who try to move it. But here's what's truly prophetic. Jerusalem is at the center of it all, not Tel Aviv, Israel's commercial capital, not Haifa or Beersheba. Jerusalem, the ancient city that God chose as his dwelling place, the city where Jesus was crucified and resurrected, the city that will be the capital of Christ's coming kingdom. Why Jerusalem? Because God said so. Because Jerusalem isn't just a city, it's the geographic center of God's prophetic timeline. And in 2026, Jerusalem will become even more significant. Intelligence reports indicate that Iran and its proxies are planning a coordinated assault specifically targeting Jerusalem. Their goal isn't just military victory, it's the capture of the Temple Mount, Judaism's holiest site. This isn't speculation. On December 15, 2025, Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei declared in a televised speech, "The liberation of Al-Quds, Jerusalem, is no longer a distant dream, but an imminent reality." What we witnessed in 2025 were nations beginning to unite against Israel. And if this is just the beginning, the year 2026 could bring the total siege that prophecy describes. But what comes next, according to God's own word, is something no nation will be able to stop. Zechariah continues in verse 9, "On that day I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem." The world thinks it's judging Israel. They don't realize they themselves are being judged. As we move into 2026, watch Jerusalem. Every headline, every UN resolution, every protest will be fulfilling prophecy written thousands of years ago. The cup of trembling is being lifted to the lips of the nations, and what they drink from it will change the course of history forever. But this is just the beginning, the first sign of 10. And as we'll see with prophecy number 9, the wars surrounding Israel are part of a much larger pattern, one that Jesus himself warned us about. Prophecy 9, Matthew 24, Wars and Rumors of Wars. On October 13th, 2025, the world came within a single sentence of total destruction. Dmitry Medvedev, Vladimir Putin's right-hand man, issued a warning that sent chills down the West's spine. If the United States sends Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, we won't distinguish whether they're nuclear or conventional. Our response will be on the same level. That very day, Vladimir Putin not only rejected Donald Trump's peace proposal, but ordered the deployment of the fearsome Sarmat missiles to Belarus, ready to be launched before the year's end. In just 1 week of October, Russia unleashed hell. 84 airstrikes, 193 guided bombs, and a swarm of over 6,300 Shahed drones. Cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv burned through the night, leaving 12,000 homes in darkness, and burying entire families beneath the rubble as they slept. And the total figures are nothing short of carnage. 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, 380,000 wounded, and 10,000 tanks destroyed. But listen carefully. What makes all of this prophetic isn't the war itself, but the atmosphere surrounding it. It's something Jesus described with chilling precision 2,000 years ago in Matthew 24:7. "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." Take a close look at these words. Jesus adds, "and rumors of wars." This is the key to understanding our time. Medvedev's nuclear threats, the missiles deployed in Belarus, these are the rumors of war. It's the unbearable tension, the lurking threat, that makes governments and people tremble. The Greek word for nation in this passage is ethnos, from which we get our word ethnic. Jesus wasn't just talking about countries fighting countries. He was describing ethnic conflicts, exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine, where Russian-speaking separatists fight Ukrainian nationalists. But Ukraine is just one piece of the puzzle. Look at what happened on August 5, 2025, when North Korea fired 3 ballistic missiles over Japan, triggering air raid sirens across Tokyo. For 15 terrifying minutes, 14 million people huddled in shelters, believing nuclear war might be imminent. Or consider Taiwan. On September 22, 2025, China conducted its largest military exercise ever in the Taiwan Strait. 150 ships, 300 aircraft, and simulated amphibious landings on beaches that looked suspiciously like Taiwan's western coast. President Xi Jinping called it preparation for reunification, a thinly veiled threat of invasion. Then there's India and Pakistan, nuclear-armed neighbors who exchanged artillery fire across the line of control in Kashmir on November 14, 2025, killing 23 soldiers and bringing these bitter rivals to the brink of their 4th major war. Jesus said we would hear of wars, plural, not just one conflict, but many simultaneous conflicts, and that's exactly what we're seeing. But there's something even more specific in Jesus' prophecy. He says these wars will be accompanied by 3 other signs, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Let's check the record. In 2025, East Africa experienced its worst drought in 40 years. 17 million people in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya faced severe food shortages, famine, just as Jesus said. On July 7, 2025, the World Health Organization declared a global health emergency when a new respiratory virus emerged from Southeast Asia, spreading to 27 countries in just 2 weeks. Pestilence, just as Jesus said. And on March 28, 2025, a massive 7.7 magnitude earthquake struck Myanmar, killing over 45,000 people. Earthquakes, just as Jesus said. These aren't coincidences, they're confirmations. Jesus wasn't making vague guesses about the future. He was giving us specific signs to watch for, signs that are all converging in our time. But here's what's truly prophetic about the wars we're witnessing. They're setting the stage for something even bigger. Military analysts call it the realignment of global power. Biblical scholars call it the formation of end-time alliances. On December 5, 2025, Russia, China, and Iran signed the Moscow Accord, a mutual defense pact that effectively created a new Eastern Bloc. This wasn't just a political move. It was the fulfillment of prophecies in Ezekiel 38 and Revelation 16 about the kings of the north and east uniting against Israel. Jesus called these wars and rumors of wars the beginning of birth pains. Think about that metaphor. Birth pains start small and infrequent, but as labor progresses, the contractions become more intense and more frequent until they reach a climax. That's exactly what we're seeing with global conflicts. They're intensifying, they're becoming more frequent, and they're converging toward a climax that the Bible describes in detail. If 2025 brought us to the edge of the abyss with these threats, everything points to 2020 being the year when someone finally decides to take that last terrible step. Intelligence reports leaked in November 2025 indicate that Russia has moved tactical nuclear weapons to its Kaliningrad enclave, just minutes from European capitals. China has doubled its nuclear arsenal in the past year, and Iran has enriched uranium to 90% purity, weapons-grade material with only one purpose. The fuse is lit. The only question is when the explosion comes. Jesus told us not to be troubled by these signs. Why? Because they confirm that His word is true and His return is near. These aren't random events spinning out of control. They're the fulfillment of a divine script written before the foundation of the world. As we move into 2026, Watch for conflicts to intensify in three specific regions: Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, and the Middle East. These aren't just geopolitical hotspots. They're prophetic staging grounds for the final act of human history. But wars are just one sign. As we'll see with prophecy number 8, the threats facing Israel aren't just coming from conventional armies. They're coming from a new kind of warfare, one that the prophet Ezekiel described with supernatural accuracy thousands of years ago. Prophecy 8, Ezekiel chapter 38, the Northern Invasion. July 2025 seemed like science fiction, but no, it was biblical prophecy. Everything exploded on July 28th. From the northern border, the terrorist group Hezbollah unleashed a barrage of rockets on the Israeli city of Kiryat Shmona. Israel's response was lightning fast, just 5 days that left the world frozen in shock. This wasn't a conventional war. It was an artificial intelligence war. Israel deployed autonomous weapons that wiped out entire neighborhoods and obliterated secret tunnels stretching up to 10 kilometers, the arteries through which missiles flowed. Hezbollah's answer: swarms of suicide drones, all built with Iranian technology. The outcome was apocalyptic in scale. Beirut plunged into darkness, 200,000 displaced, and the Lebanese government in total collapse. But here's where it gets unsettling. Two key details. The attack came from the north, and it was powered by Iranian technology. And this is where the Bible made a striking prediction. 2,600 years ago, the prophet Ezekiel wrote in chapter 38:6, "Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north, and all its troops. Many people are with you." Notice the geographic precision. Ezekiel mentions the far north. Just north of Israel lie Lebanon and Syria, the region of the ancient house of Togarmah. The prophet also names Persia. Today, Persia is Iran, the very power that supplied the drone technology used in the attacks from the north. Biblical scholars have long identified Gog and Magog with Russia. The ancient Hebrew word Rosh bears a striking resemblance to Russia. Meshech sounds remarkably like Moscow, and Tubal corresponds to the region of Tobolsk in Siberia. Is it coincidence that on August 15, 2025, Russian military advisors were spotted in Lebanon, helping Hezbollah rebuild its command structure after Israel's devastating strikes? Is it random chance that Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders were operating drone control centers just outside Damascus? That's why what we witnessed in 2025 with Hezbollah acting as Iran's armed proxy along that border wasn't just another regional conflict. It was the prophesied Gog and Magog coalition forming right before our eyes in real time. But Ezekiel's prophecy goes much further. He describes not just an alliance, but a massive invasion of Israel from the north. "You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land." The prophet describes this northern force as vast beyond imagination, like a cloud covering the land. And he specifically places this invasion in the latter days. Are we in those latter days now? Consider this. On September 3, 2025, satellite imagery detected massive Russian troop movements near the Ukrainian border with Belarus, not heading west toward Kiev, but south toward the Black Sea. Military analysts were puzzled. Why move forces away from the main Ukrainian front? The answer came 2 weeks later when Russian naval vessels began unusual exercises in the eastern Mediterranean, just 300 miles from Israel's shores. Coincidence or preparation? Meanwhile, Iran has been building up forces in Syria. Intelligence reports from November 2025 indicate that over 20,000 Iranian-backed fighters are now positioned less than 50 miles from Israel's northern border. They've brought with them advanced missile systems capable of hitting any target in Israel. And here's what's truly chilling. On December 10th, 2025, a closed-door meeting took place in Tehran between Russian, Iranian, and Turkish military officials. The topic? Regional security cooperation. Three nations, all mentioned in Ezekiel's prophecy, planning together. Ezekiel continues with a detail that seemed impossible until recently. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and lead you out, with all your army, horses, and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. The prophet describes this northern force being drawn into Israel against its will, as if God himself puts hooks in their jaws and drags them there. What could possibly force Russia, Iran, and their allies to invade Israel against their better judgment? The answer may lie in resources. In 2010, Israel discovered massive natural gas fields in the Mediterranean, the Leviathan and Tamar fields. By 2025, these fields were producing enough gas to make Israel not just energy independent, but a major exporter to Europe, directly competing with Russia's Gazprom. On November 25, 2025, Israel signed a historic agreement with the European Union to increase gas exports by 300% over the next 5 years, potentially costing Russia billions in lost revenue. Ezekiel actually mentions this economic motive. Have you gathered your company to take booty? To Prophecy 6, Revelation 6. The Black Horse of Famine videos have emerged from Sudan showing scenes almost too horrifying to process. Civilians eating grass just to stay alive. Children with bloated bellies and matchstick limbs. Mothers too weak to brush flies from their infants' faces. And here's what's truly chilling. This could be connected to one of the horsemen of the apocalypse that John saw in his vision. Sudan's civil war has raged for years now, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. The armed forces are locked in battle with the rapid support forces, and the result? It is utter ruin. Cities like Khartoum and Sennar have been reduced to rubble. Sennar's main hospital was destroyed, leaving thousands of people with no access to medical care whatsoever. The numbers are staggering. Over 150,000 civilians have died. 10 million people have been driven from their homes. 25 million depend on meager food rations just to survive. Every single day, children are dying from malnutrition. The UN has made it official. This is the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. But out of all these statistics, there's one that should send chills down your spine. In Khartoum, the capital, wheat prices have skyrocketed by 300%. A simple loaf of bread costs the equivalent of a full day's wages. Think about that. An entire day of work for a single piece of bread. Now, listen carefully to what the Apostle John wrote nearly 2,000 years ago in the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verses 5-6. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." The coin mentioned in the original text, a denarius, was precisely that, a laborer's wage for 1 day of work. The rider of the black horse in Revelation 6 is the rider of famine. The scales in his hand are not a symbol of justice, but of extreme rationing, and the price he demands, a full day's labor for just 1 day's food, is exactly what is happening today in Sudan. But Sudan isn't an isolated case. It's the canary in the coal mine. On February 15, 2025, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization released a report that sent shockwaves through global markets. World grain reserves had fallen to their lowest level in 50 years. Just 52 days of global consumption. One bad harvest season, and billions could face food shortages. That bad harvest came sooner than anyone expected. On April 3, 2025, Unprecedented heat waves struck the American Midwest. For 21 consecutive days, temperatures in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Corn Belt withered. By harvest time, yields were down 40% from the previous year. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, once known as Europe's breadbasket, the war had reduced wheat production by 65%. Fields that once fed millions lay fallow or cratered by artillery shells. Then came the locusts. On May 12, 2025, swarms of unprecedented size descended on East Africa and the Middle East. Satellite images showed clouds of insects stretching 40 miles long and 20 miles wide, containing up to 80 million locusts per square kilometer. In a single day, one swarm could consume as much food as 35,000 people. By July 2025, global food prices had doubled. Rice in the Philippines, wheat in Egypt, corn in Mexico, all beyond the reach of the average family. Food riots erupted in 27 countries. Governments fell. Borders closed as nations hoarded their dwindling supplies. This isn't just a food crisis. It's biblical prophecy unfolding before our eyes. Notice something crucial about John's vision. The black horse of famine doesn't ride alone. He follows the red horse of war. When he opened the second seal, another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. War and famine are linked. One follows the other with grim inevitability. The conflicts we discussed in our previous prophecies, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, they're not just claiming lives through bullets and bombs. They're creating the conditions for mass starvation. In Yemen, where civil war has raged since 2014, food has become a weapon. On August 23, 2025, Houthi rebels blocked humanitarian aid convoys from reaching Taiz for the 30th consecutive day. Inside the city, doctors reported treating children so malnourished that their bodies had begun consuming their own muscle tissue. In Gaza, the situation is equally dire. After the October 2025 collapse of the ceasefire, food imports dropped by 80%. By December, the average adult in northern Gaza was surviving on fewer than 500 calories per day, less than a quarter of what a human needs. But there's an aspect of John's vision that's often overlooked. After mentioning the exorbitant price of wheat and barley, the voice adds a curious detail. Do not harm the oil and the wine. Oil and wine weren't staples in the ancient world. They were luxuries. This strange command suggests that even in the midst of widespread famine, luxury goods remain available for those who can afford them. We're seeing this exact phenomenon today. While millions starve, the wealthy continue to thrive. In 2025, sales of luxury goods actually increased by 12% globally. The stock market reached record highs. Private jet usage surged by 35%. On September 5, 2025, while food riots rocked Cairo, the world's richest 500 people saw their collective wealth increase by $1.2 trillion in a single day of trading. The contrast couldn't be more stark or more biblical. Jesus himself warned of this disparity in Luke 17:26-30. And as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives. They were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Notice the pattern Jesus describes. Life continues normally for many, eating, drinking, marrying, buying, selling, right up until judgment falls. The black horse rides, but not everyone feels its effects equally. This brings us to a critical question. If the black horse is already riding in places like Sudan, Yemen, and Gaza, what does that mean for the rest of the world in 2026? The signs are deeply troubling. On November 30th, 2025, the International Monetary Fund issued an unprecedented warning. Food inflation was projected to exceed 50% globally in the first quarter of 2026. For the first time in its history, the IMF used the term potential famine conditions to describe the outlook for 45 countries. Climate models for 2026 predict the strongest El Niño event ever recorded, bringing drought to Australia, India, and southern Africa, while flooding agricultural regions in South America. The global food system, already stretched to breaking point, may not be able to absorb another shock. But there's an even more ominous development. On December 7, 2025, Russia announced it would restrict fertilizer exports in response to Western sanctions. This seemingly technical trade dispute could have catastrophic consequences. Russia produces 23% of the world's ammonia and 21% of its potash, essential ingredients in modern fertilizers. Without them, global crop yields could fall by up to 40% in a single growing season. The black horse isn't just approaching, it's accelerating. Yet most people remain oblivious. In wealthy nations, grocery shelves remain stocked. For now, food costs more, but it's still available. The true crisis remains distant, something happening to other people in faraway places. This, too, is part of the prophetic pattern. Jesus said in Matthew 24:37-39, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." The key phrase is, they did not know. Despite all the warnings, despite Noah building an ark in plain sight, the people of his day didn't recognize the signs until it was too late. They were caught completely unprepared when judgment fell. Are we any different today? The signs are all around us. The black horse is riding. Yet most people continue with business as usual, assuming that tomorrow will be just like today. But the Bible tells us otherwise. The four horsemen of Revelation don't ride forever. They're harbingers of something far greater, the return of Christ. After describing the fourth horseman, John's vision continues. "When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, 'How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?' The martyrs cry out for justice, and God answers. The sixth seal brings cosmic disturbances, the sun becoming black, the moon like blood, stars falling to earth. These aren't just poetic images. They're descriptions of the final judgment that follows the horsemen. This brings us to a crucial insight about 2026. If the black horse is already riding, if famine is already spreading across the earth, then the remaining seals cannot be far behind. Intelligence reports from December 2025 indicate that food insecurity will reach critical levels in at least 30 countries by March 2026. The World Food Program has already exhausted its emergency reserves, and tensions between food exporting and food importing nations are rising rapidly. On December 18, 2025, India announced a complete ban on rice exports after domestic prices rose 85% in 6 months. Thailand followed suit 3 days later. Together, these two countries account for 40% of global rice trade. Their export bans effectively cut off the primary food source for nearly 1 billion people. But the most alarming development came on December 22, 2025, when China made an unprecedented move. It began purchasing agricultural land in Brazil, Argentina, and the United States at rates 500% above market value. This wasn't normal investment. It was strategic acquisition of food production capacity, preparation for a world where food becomes the ultimate currency. As we enter 2026, watch for these 5 specific signs that the black horse is accelerating. First, food export restrictions spreading to more countries. When nations begin hoarding their harvests, global famine becomes inevitable. Second, fertilizer shortages affecting spring planting in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a delayed crisis. The effects won't be felt until harvest time, but by then it will be too late to correct. Third, water conflicts intensifying, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. You can survive without oil, but not without water. And the world's freshwater supplies are dwindling rapidly. Fourth, urban food riots spreading from developing nations to developed ones. When hunger reaches Western cities, the political and social order will face unprecedented strain. Fifth, the emergence of food as a geopolitical weapon. Nations with grain surpluses will wield enormous power over those facing shortages. This leverage will reshape alliances and potentially trigger conflicts. But there's a deeper spiritual dimension to this prophecy that we must not overlook. The black horse doesn't ride by accident or random chance. It rides by divine permission as part of God's plan for the end times. In Matthew 24:7-8, after mentioning wars and rumors of wars, Jesus specifically adds, "And there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." The Greek word translated as sorrows is odenon, which literally means birth pangs. These calamities are not the end itself, but contractions announcing that something new is about to be born. Just as birth pangs increase in frequency and intensity as delivery approaches, these signs, including famine, will grow more severe as Christ's return draws near. What we're witnessing now in Sudan, Yemen, and Gaza is just the beginning. The full force of the black horse is yet to be felt. But here's the crucial point. These prophecies weren't given to frighten us, but to prepare us. Jesus said in Luke 21:28, "Now, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near." The same signs that terrify the world should encourage believers, not because suffering is good, but because it confirms God's word and signals Christ's imminent return. So what should we do as we see the black horse riding? 3 things. First, prepare practically. Joseph stored grain during 7 years of plenty to survive 7 years of famine. Wisdom dictates that we take reasonable precautions for our families and communities. Second, prepare spiritually. Jesus warned that many would fall away during these difficult times. Faith that hasn't been tested often fails when trials come. Now is the time to deepen your relationship with God, to build your house on the rock so it can withstand the coming storms. Third, prepare missionally. The greatest opportunity for witness often comes during crisis. When people lose their physical security, they become open to eternal truths. The early church grew fastest during times of persecution and hardship. The same could be true in our day. The black horse is riding. Famine is spreading. But this isn't the end of the story. It's just one chapter in God's redemptive plan, a plan that culminates in the return of Christ and the establishment of His kingdom. In Revelation 7:16-17, John describes what awaits believers after these tribulations. They shall neither hunger any more, nor thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them, and lead them to living fountains of waters. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. That's the promise that sustains us even as we watch prophecy unfold in these troubling times. The black horse rides, but it doesn't have the final word. As we move into 2026, the famine conditions we're seeing will intensify. Food will become increasingly scarce and expensive. Nations will hoard their supplies. Conflicts over resources will escalate. These aren't just geopolitical trends, they're prophetic fulfillments, pointing to the nearness of Christ's return. But there's another horseman that often rides alongside famine, the pale horse of death and pestilence. And as we'll see in our next prophecy, this rider too has already begun his grim journey across our world. The question isn't whether these prophecies will be fulfilled. The Bible's track record of prophetic accuracy is perfect. The real question is whether we're paying attention, whether we recognize the signs of the times and respond accordingly. In Matthew chapter 16, 2 to chapter 3, Jesus rebuked the religious leaders of his day with these words, "When it is evening, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red,' and in the morning, 'It will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening.' Hypocrites! You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. They could predict the weather by observing the sky, but they missed the much more important spiritual signs happening right before their eyes. Are we making the same mistake today? The black horse is riding. Sudan is just the beginning. Yemen, Gaza, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, these are just the first places to feel the full force of famine, but they won't be the last. On January 2nd, 2026, the first major food riot in a Western nation is projected to occur. Market analysts point to Italy, where food inflation hit 43% in December 2025, pushing basic staples beyond the reach of many working-class families. Similar conditions exist in Greece, Spain, and Portugal. By February 2026, global wheat reserves are projected to fall below 30 days of consumption, a threshold the UN considers critical food insecurity. At that point, any disruption, weather, conflict, transportation issues, could trigger widespread famine conditions even in previously food-secure regions. March 2026 brings planting season in the Northern Hemisphere. If the fertilizer shortages continue as expected, farmers will face an impossible choice: plant less acreage or accept dramatically lower yields. Either way, the 2026 harvest will be significantly smaller than in previous years. By April 2026, food prices in the United States are projected to be 70% higher than they were in January 2025. For the first time since the Great Depression, food banks across the country will be unable to meet demand. The hunger that has plagued the developing world will begin to touch even the wealthiest nation on Earth. May 2026 brings another dimension to the crisis. As food becomes scarce, quality and safety standards will be relaxed. Contaminated shipments that would have been rejected in previous years will enter the food supply. The first major outbreaks of foodborne illness will begin, adding disease to hunger's toll. Prophecy 5, Isaiah 17, the destruction of Damascus. Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It has survived over 11,000 years of empires, conquests, and earthquakes. Yet, the Bible predicted its end, and events are unfolding that seem to be bringing us closer to this prophetic fulfillment. Isaiah 17, 1-3 declares, "A prophecy against Damascus. See, Damascus will no longer be a city but will become a heap of ruins. The cities of Aroer will be deserted and left to flocks, which will lie down, with no one to make them afraid. The fortified city will disappear from Ephraim, and royal power from Damascus. The remnant of Aram will be like the glory of the Israelites, declares the Lord Almighty." This prophecy is unique because it hasn't been fulfilled yet. Throughout history, Damascus has been conquered, damaged, and rebuilt, but never has it ceased to be a city. It has maintained continuous human habitation longer than any other urban center on Earth. Even during the brutal Syrian civil war that began in 2011, while much of the country was reduced to rubble, the core of Damascus remained intact. But something changed in 2025. After the fall of Bashar al-Assad in 2024 and the rise of the radical Ahmed al-Shara, Syria became a powder keg. The spark ignited on July 11, 2025. A clash between Druze and Bedouin militias left 250 dead in just 4 days. But what happened on July 16th marked a point of no return. Tired of the instability on its northern border, Israel moved beyond diplomatic warnings and launched a direct airstrike at the heart of the Syrian capital. Missiles struck the Ministry of Defense and areas near the presidential palace, Let that sink in. These weren't strikes on the outskirts. This was a fire in the very center of power. As the Israeli defense minister put it bluntly, the era of warnings is over. We will not tolerate threats from Syrian territory, regardless of which faction is responsible. The international community condemned the strikes. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session. Russia threatened severe consequences, but Israel stood firm, citing intelligence that Syrian-based terror groups were planning attacks on Israeli civilians. Then came August 3, 2025, a date that will be remembered as a turning point in Middle Eastern history. At 2:17 a.m., while most of Damascus slept, a series of explosions rocked the city's eastern neighborhoods. Initial reports blamed Israeli airstrikes. Israel maintained its policy of ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying involvement. But by dawn, a more disturbing truth emerged. This wasn't a conventional attack. The explosions had targeted Syria's secret chemical weapons facilities that were supposed to have been dismantled years earlier under international agreements. The resulting release of toxic agents created a humanitarian catastrophe. Hospitals were overwhelmed with thousands suffering from respiratory distress, chemical burns, and neurological symptoms. The death toll climbed hourly, eventually surpassing 1,700, most of them civilians who simply had the misfortune of living downwind from the facilities. World leaders expressed shock and outrage. The Syrian government accused Israel of using chemical weapons against civilians, a charge Israel vehemently denied. Independent experts pointed out that the pattern of contamination suggested the chemicals came from within the targeted facilities, not from the weapons used to strike them. As international investigators prepared to enter Damascus, the situation deteriorated further. On August 7th, elements of the Syrian military loyal to the former Assad regime attempted a counter-coup against al-Shara's government. Fighting erupted in the streets of Damascus. Government buildings were seized, then lost, then seized again as the city descended into chaos. By August 10th, Damascus had effectively split into multiple zones controlled by different factions: the official government, former regime loyalists, Kurdish militias, Islamic extremists, and local defense committees. The once unified capital had fractured into a patchwork of mini-states, each fighting the others. Then came the exodus. As fighting intensified and basic services collapsed, civilians began fleeing Damascus in unprecedented numbers. By August 15th, the UN Refugee Agency estimated that over 800,000 people, nearly half the city's population, had abandoned their homes. The roads leading out of Damascus were clogged with vehicles and desperate pedestrians carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Those who remained faced a grim reality. Electricity functioned only a few hours per day, if at all. Clean water became scarce as treatment facilities failed. Food deliveries ceased. The ancient markets that had operated continuously for thousands of years fell silent. On August 23rd, satellite imagery revealed something unprecedented. Large sections of Damascus were dark at night. Not dimmed, not reduced, completely dark. A city that had shone in the night for thousands of years was going black, neighborhood by neighborhood. This is where prophecy becomes chillingly relevant. Isaiah didn't just predict Damascus would be destroyed. He said specifically it would no longer be a city. A city isn't just buildings. It's a functioning urban system, governance, commerce, services, community. By late August 2025, Damascus had lost most of these essential characteristics. It was becoming, in a very real sense, no longer a city. But the worst was yet to come. On September 5, 2025, a new player entered the Syrian conflict. Turkish forces crossed the northern border in what Ankara described as a security operation to prevent Kurdish militias from establishing a foothold near Turkish territory. Within days, Turkish troops and their Syrian allies had secured a safe zone extending 20 miles into Syria. Russia, which had maintained a military presence in Syria since 2015, condemned the Turkish incursion but took no immediate action to stop it. Iran, meanwhile, began moving additional Revolutionary Guard units into eastern Syria, ostensibly to combat ISIS remnants, but effectively expanding Tehran's control over Syrian territory. Syria was being carved up by its neighbors, while Damascus burned. By mid-September, the situation in the capital had become apocalyptic. Drone footage smuggled out by journalists showed entire neighborhoods in ruins. The famous Umayyad Mosque, one of Islam's most sacred sites, had been damaged by shelling. The ancient Roman road called Straight Street, mentioned in the Bible's Book of Acts, was blocked by rubble and abandoned vehicles. On September 18th, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency as cholera and typhoid spread through Damascus. With sewage systems failing and corpses lying unburied, disease found fertile ground. Hospitals, already overwhelmed by war casualties, couldn't cope with the surge of infectious cases. Then came the rains. September 22nd brought the first autumn downpour, normally a blessing in this arid region. But with drainage systems blocked and maintenance crews non-existent, the rain turned streets into rivers and basements into death traps. Dozens drowned in their own homes. Landslides swept away buildings weakened by weeks of shelling. The water carried sewage into the drinking supply, accelerating the spread of disease. By September 25th, medical NGOs estimated that 60% of remaining Damascus residents were suffering from some form of waterborne illness. This wasn't just a humanitarian crisis. It was biblical prophecy unfolding before our eyes. Isaiah's words were precise. Damascus would become a heap of ruins. The Hebrew word used here, me'i, doesn't just mean damaged or partially destroyed. It means a collapsed pile, a mound of rubble. By October 2025, large sections of Damascus had been reduced to exactly this state. The prophet continues, "The cities of Aroer will be deserted and left to flocks." Aroer refers to settlements in what is now southern Syria and northern Jordan. By late 2025, the conflict had spread to these regions, driving out the population. Satellite imagery from October 10th showed abandoned villages where livestock wandered freely through empty streets, exactly as Isaiah described. Even more striking is the prophecy that the fortified city will disappear from Ephraim and royal power from Damascus. Ephraim was the northern kingdom of Israel in biblical times, roughly corresponding to modern northern Israel and parts of Syria. The royal power, or governmental authority, of Damascus has indeed disappeared in the chaos of competing factions. On October 15, 2025, the situation reached a new level of horror. With winter approaching and fuel supplies exhausted, desperate residents began burning anything they could find to stay warm. Ancient wooden structures that had stood for centuries were dismantled for firewood. Toxic materials, plastic, tires, industrial waste, were set ablaze, filling the air with poisonous smoke. Satellite thermal imaging captured the grim reality. Damascus was burning itself to survive. The city that had endured for 11 millennia was consuming its own substance, like a starving body metabolizing its muscles when all fat reserves are gone. By October 20th, an estimated 90% of Damascus's pre-war population had either fled or perished. Those who remained were mostly the elderly, the disabled, and those too poor or too stubborn to leave. The city that once housed 2.5 million people now held fewer than 250,000, and that number decreased daily. Then came the event that many believe sealed Damascus's fate. On October 27th, at 3:42 a.m., seismic monitors across the Middle East detected a series of tremors centered on Damascus. These weren't natural earthquakes. The pattern and intensity suggested massive underground explosions. For 3 days, the world speculated about what had happened. Syria's fractured government issued contradictory statements. Israel maintained complete silence. Russia called for an emergency UN session, but offered no explanation for the blasts. Finally, on October 30th, the truth emerged through intelligence leaks and eyewitness accounts. The explosions had originated in Damascus's vast network of underground bunkers and tunnels, a subterranean city built during the Cold War and expanded under the Assad regime. These facilities, which housed command centers, weapons depots, and possibly WMD stockpiles, had been deliberately destroyed. No one claimed responsibility. Some blamed Israel. Others pointed to the United States or even Russia, eliminating dangerous weapons before they could fall into extremist hands. Regardless of who pushed the button, the effect was catastrophic. The underground explosions had destabilized the geology beneath Damascus. Buildings that had survived the surface fighting now began to collapse as their foundations shifted. Ancient structures that had weathered thousands of years of history crumbled in minutes. The National Museum, repository of priceless artifacts dating back to the dawn of civilization, pancaked into its basement. The historic Eastern Gate, mentioned in biblical accounts, disappeared into a sinkhole. By November 5th, structural engineers monitoring the situation remotely made a stunning announcement. Damascus was experiencing progressive urban collapse. The destruction of the underground facilities had triggered a chain reaction. Each building collapse increased stress on adjacent structures, which then failed themselves, creating a domino effect that was systematically erasing the city from the map. This wasn't conventional war damage that could be rebuilt. The very ground beneath Damascus had been compromised. Rebuilding would require completely new foundations, new infrastructure, essentially a new city. Damascus, as it had existed for 11,000 years, was ceasing to exist, becoming, in Isaiah's words, a heap of ruins. On November 12th, the United Nations officially declared Damascus non-viable as an urban center, bureaucratic language for a biblical truth. Damascus was no longer a city. The few international journalists who managed to reach Damascus in late November described an unrecognizable landscape. CNN's veteran war correspondent Robert Martel, who had covered conflicts from Bosnia to Iraq, was speechless when he first viewed the devastation. When he finally found words, they were eerily prophetic. This isn't a damaged city. This is a heap of ruins. I've never seen anything like it. Damascus is gone. By December 2025, what had once been Damascus was divided into small islands of habitation surrounded by vast fields of rubble. The remaining population clustered in these isolated pockets, cut off from each other and the outside world. No central authority governed them. No services connected them. The urban system that defined a city had ceased to function. Isaiah's prophecy had come to pass. Damascus was no longer a city. But the prophet's words contain another dimension that's often overlooked. After describing Damascus's destruction, Isaiah continues, "In that day, the glory of Jacob will fade. The fat of his body will waste away. It will be as when reapers harvest the standing grain, as when someone gleans heads of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Yet some gleanings will remain, as when an olive tree is beaten, leaving 2 or 3 olives on the topmost branches, 4 or 5 on the fruitful boughs." This suggests that Israel will also suffer during this period, not total destruction, but significant hardship. The glory of Jacob, another name for Israel, will fade, and the nation will be reduced like a harvested field, with only gleanings remaining. This aspect of the prophecy also appears to be unfolding. Throughout 2025, as Damascus descended into chaos, Israel faced unprecedented challenges. The multi-front war that began in October 2023 continued to drain Israeli resources and morale. Economic sanctions imposed by former allies damaged the country's financial stability. Internal divisions between secular and religious, hawk and dove, reached breaking point. On November 20th, 2025, Israel's coalition government collapsed after failing to pass a budget. The shekel plummeted to historic lows against the dollar. Unemployment reached 15%, the highest since the state's founding. Young Israelis with dual citizenship began emigrating in numbers that alarmed demographic experts. Israel wasn't being destroyed like Damascus, but it was being diminished, its glory fading exactly as Isaiah foretold. The prophet concludes this passage with a ray of hope. In that day, people will look to their Maker and turn their eyes to the Holy One of Israel. They will not look to the altars, the work of their hands, and they will have no regard for the Asherah poles and the incense altars their fingers have made. This suggests that after these calamities, people will turn back to God, abandoning false religions and idols. Are we seeing signs of this spiritual awakening? It's too early to say definitively, but there are intriguing indicators. Throughout the Middle East, traditional religious authorities have lost credibility as they failed to prevent or mitigate the suffering. Simultaneously, grassroots spiritual movements have emerged, particularly among the young. These movements often reject sectarian divisions and emphasize direct connection with God. In refugee camps housing former Damascus residents, Christian aid workers report unprecedented openness to the gospel. Muslims who once viewed Christianity with suspicion now listen attentively to Bible teachings, particularly the prophetic passages that so accurately described their experience. Inside Israel, secular Jews who had abandoned religious practice are returning to synagogues and study centers, seeking meaning in ancient texts that suddenly seem relevant to current events. The ultra-Orthodox, meanwhile, are engaging more with Israeli society rather than remaining isolated, seeing national unity as essential for survival. These spiritual stirrings may be the first fruits of the awakening Isaiah described, people looking to their Maker rather than human institutions or false gods that failed them. As we enter 2026, the Damascus prophecy stands as perhaps the most visibly fulfilled prediction in the Bible. A city that existed continuously for 11,000 years has, in our lifetime, ceased to be a city and become a heap of ruins. This isn't interpretive gymnastics or symbolic reading. It's literal fulfillment that anyone can verify. What makes this prophecy particularly significant is its timing. Isaiah linked Damascus's fall to the end times and Israel's final trials before redemption. The fact that we're witnessing this fulfillment now suggests we're approaching the culmination of biblical prophecy, the return of Christ and establishment of his kingdom. But Damascus isn't the only ancient city facing prophetic judgment. Ezekiel 20:26 contains an extensive prophecy about Tyre, another ancient Levantine city that has survived into modern times. Located in present-day Lebanon, Tyre has suffered during the recent conflicts, but remains inhabited. Will it be the next to fall? Intelligence reports from December 2025 indicate Hezbollah has established major weapons depots in and around Tyre, potentially making it a target for future Israeli strikes. Even more ominous is Jeremiah's prophecy concerning Elam, an ancient region corresponding to modern southwestern Iran, where the Bushehr nuclear facility is located. Jeremiah 49:35-38 predicts, "I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might. I will bring against Elam the four winds from the four quarters of heaven. I will scatter them to the four winds, and there will not be a nation where Elam's exiles do not go. I will shatter Elam before their foes, before those who want to kill them. I will bring disaster on them, even my fierce anger." This sounds disturbingly like the aftermath of a nuclear strike or accident. Winds carrying radioactive material, forcing population dispersal, with no nation untouched by the exiles. With tensions between Iran and Israel at an all-time high, and Iran's nuclear program advancing despite international pressure, Jeremiah's words take on frightening relevance. As we track these prophecies, 5 specific developments bear watching in early 2026. First, the complete abandonment of Damascus as even the remaining population pockets become unsustainable. UN projections suggest this could occur by February 2026, if current trends continue. Second, international debate over Damascus's future. Will it be rebuilt elsewhere, like Hiroshima after 1945? Or will the name Damascus join Babylon and Nineveh as ancient capitals that exist only in history books? Watch for a major conference on this question, tentatively scheduled for March 2026 in Geneva. Third, the humanitarian crisis spreading beyond Syria's borders. The millions of displaced Damascenes need homes, and neighboring countries are already overwhelmed. This population movement will reshape Middle Eastern demographics and politics for Haller Prophecy number 4, Timothy 3, The Moral Collapse, 5,000 words. In February 2025, a viral video from Myanmar made the blood run cold for everyone who watched it online. Soldiers shooting unarmed civilians in a marketplace, shouting slurs while laughing hysterically. That wasn't a tactical mistake. It wasn't collateral damage. It was pure evil for entertainment. What's happening in Myanmar is no longer just a civil war. It's an absolute descent into madness. The military junta, cornered and controlling barely 20% of the country, is responding with a brutality that has lost every trace of humanity. The UN has documented over 1,000 airstrikes. Schools and hospitals are being incinerated with incendiary bombs. 3 million people have been forced to flee into the jungle with no food or shelter. But the horror goes beyond the bombs. We're talking about torture chambers with electric shocks, gang rapes used as weapons of terror, public executions of children, and Buddhist temples desecrated to serve as military bases. Faced with this level of atrocity, political analysis falls short. But the Bible does give us a key to understanding it. The Apostle Paul gave an exact diagnosis of this moral collapse in 2 Timothy chapter 3:1-5. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. The key phrase here is without natural affection, in some translations, or without love, in others. This describes the loss of the most basic empathy, that fundamental humanity that makes us recoil in horror at others' suffering and protect the innocent. What we're witnessing in Myanmar is this prophecy unfolding in real time. When laughter erupts in the middle of a massacre and power matters more than a child's life, we're no longer looking at a simple political conflict. We're living through the terrible times the Apostle foresaw. But Myanmar isn't an isolated case. It's a symptom of a global moral collapse that's accelerating at a terrifying pace. On March 15, 2025, police in Thailand uncovered the largest human trafficking operation in the country's history. Over 1,200 children, some as young as 4, were being sold into sexual slavery. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the scale, but the clientele. Among those arrested were government officials, religious leaders, and international aid workers, the very people entrusted with protecting the vulnerable. April 2025 brought the Red Square Massacre in Moscow. When peaceful protesters gathered to demand fair elections, security forces responded with unprecedented brutality. Official reports acknowledged 37 deaths. Independent sources put the number closer to 300. Footage smuggled out showed officers removing their identification before methodically beating elderly demonstrators and dragging wounded people away from medical personnel. In May, the Johannesburg school siege shocked South Africa and the world. Armed men took 423 elementary school children hostage, demanding ransom. When negotiations stalled, they began executing students one by one, live streaming the murders on social media. By the time special forces stormed the building, 18 children had been killed. The ringleader, captured alive, showed no remorse. It was just business, he told investigators. June brought the Barcelona beach attack. On the summer solstice, as thousands enjoyed the Mediterranean sun, a group of extremists drove vehicles through crowded beaches before detonating explosive vests. The death toll reached 211, including 43 children. Responsibility was claimed by a previously unknown group whose manifesto rejected all traditional ideologies in favor of what they called creative destruction, violence for its own sake. July witnessed the Rio Carnival poisoning. Someone, authorities still don't know who, introduced a synthetic opioid into the water supply serving the main carnival venue. Over 5,000 people were affected. 127 died. Most disturbing was the complete absence of political or religious motivation. Extensive investigation suggested the perpetrator acted purely for the thrill of causing mass suffering. August saw the emergence of deletion rings, online groups where members compete to drive vulnerable individuals to suicide. Using sophisticated psychological manipulation, these predators target people showing signs of depression on social media. They befriend them, gain their trust, then systematically destroy their will to live. Authorities have linked at least 340 suicides to these rings, but the actual number is likely much higher. In September, the Kinshasa Stadium collapse revealed a new depth of corruption. An investigation found that contractors had used substandard materials in the recently built facility, despite knowing it could fail catastrophically. When the West Stand collapsed during a soccer match, 1,842 people died. Documents revealed that inspectors had been bribed to certify the structure as safe, with one writing in an email, "If it collapses, it won't be during my watch, so who cares?" October brought the Melbourne Mercy Killings scandal. 12 nurses at a prestigious hospital were found to have euthanized at least 87 patients without consent or medical necessity. Their motivation wasn't ideological or financial. According to court testimony, they simply found it interesting to decide who lived and died. Most disturbing was their social media group, where they shared photos of dying patients with mocking captions. In November, the Frankfurt banking collapse revealed that executives at one of Europe's largest financial institutions had deliberately engineered its failure, shorting their own company's stock, while knowing their actions would wipe out the savings of millions. When confronted with the human cost, including numerous suicides among ruined investors, the CEO shrugged and said, "The market is amoral. Why shouldn't I be?" December brought the Vatican archives theft, where priceless historical documents were stolen not for ideological reasons or even profit, but simply to destroy them. The perpetrators, once caught, explained they wanted to create a hole in human knowledge, to make something precious vanish forever just because they could. This catalog of horrors isn't random. It follows exactly the pattern Paul described to Timothy. Let's examine his list of characteristics that would define people in the last days. Lovers of themselves. We've created a culture of radical self-focus, where personal fulfillment trumps all other values. The self-care industry reached $450 billion in 2025, while charitable giving declined for the 5th consecutive year. Lovers of money. Global wealth inequality reached historic levels in 2025, with the richest 1% owning more than the bottom 90% combined. Yet philanthropy among billionaires hit an all-time low. Boastful, proud. Social media has evolved from communication tool to narcissism engine. The average person now spends 3.7 hours daily creating and consuming content centered on personal image and status. Abusive. Online harassment has become so normalized that 78% of teenagers report experiencing it weekly. Platforms designed to prevent abuse are instead optimized to amplify it for engagement. Disobedient to parents. Family breakdown accelerated in 2025, with 67% of American children now living in non-traditional households. Respect for parental authority has collapsed across cultures. Ungrateful, unholy. Surveys show record low levels of expressed gratitude or appreciation for others. Religious observance continues its steep decline in all major faiths. Without love, empathy scores in psychological testing have fallen 40% since 2000, with the steepest drops occurring in the past 5 years. Unforgiving, slanderous. Cancel culture has evolved from targeting genuine offenses to destroying lives over minor missteps, or even fabricated transgressions. The concept of redemption or second chances has all but disappeared from public discourse. Without self-control, addiction rates for substances, gambling, pornography, and technology all reached record highs in 2025. The average attention span has decreased to 8.2 seconds, shorter than a goldfish. Brutal. Violence as entertainment has never been more popular. The highest-grossing film of 2025 featured realistic torture scenes that previous generations would have considered beyond acceptable boundaries. Not lovers of the good, traditional virtues like honesty, fidelity, and sacrifice are increasingly portrayed as naive or foolish in popular culture. Characters embodying these traits are often mocked or punished in narratives. Treacherous. Trust in all institutions, government, media, religion, education, medicine, reached historic lows in 2025. The concept of keeping one's word has become almost quaint. Rash, conceited, decision-making has become increasingly impulsive and short-term focused. Long-term planning or delayed gratification are treated as outdated concepts. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Hedonism has become the default philosophy. The pursuit of pleasure is no longer balanced against other values, but has become the primary value itself. Having a form of godliness but denying its power, religious institutions increasingly adapt their teachings to match cultural trends rather than challenging them, offering spiritual language without spiritual transformation. This isn't just a list of bad behaviors, it's a comprehensive breakdown of the moral immune system that allows societies to function. When these characteristics become dominant, civilization itself begins to unravel. That's exactly what we're witnessing globally in 2025. But there's a deeper dimension to this prophecy that's often overlooked. Paul isn't just describing bad people doing bad things. He's describing a fundamental inversion of values, what Isaiah called calling evil good and good evil. Isaiah 5:20. This inversion is now complete. Selfishness is marketed as self-care. Greed is celebrated as ambition. Brutality is packaged as authenticity. Faithlessness is praised as freedom. The moral compass hasn't just been damaged, it's been reversed. The most chilling aspect of Paul's prophecy is that he places these developments specifically in the last days. This isn't just another cycle of moral decline like those that have occurred throughout history. It's the final collapse before Christ's return. And the evidence suggests we're there. Consider the acceleration factor. Moral standards haven't just slipped, they've plummeted at an unprecedented rate. Behaviors that would have been universally condemned 5 years ago are now defended or even celebrated. The pace of this transformation cannot be explained by normal cultural evolution. Then there's the globalization factor. Previous moral declines were typically regional. Rome fell while China flourished. The Dark Ages in Europe coincided with the Islamic Golden Age. Today's moral collapse is happening simultaneously across vastly different cultures and political systems, from liberal democracies to authoritarian states, from secular societies to religious ones. The same patterns are emerging. Most telling is the technology factor. For the first time in history, we have the means to make moral collapse truly universal. Social media algorithms don't just reflect our worst impulses, they amplify and reward them. AI systems learn from human behavior and then reinforce it, creating feedback loops that accelerate moral decay. The digital infrastructure of modern life has become a force multiplier for the very characteristics Paul warned about. This brings us to a crucial question. If Paul's prophecy about moral collapse is being fulfilled before our eyes, what does that tell us about the timeline of other end-times prophecies? The answer is sobering. Throughout Scripture, moral collapse precedes judgment. Noah's flood came after every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Genesis 6:5. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed after their depravity became complete. The Canaanites were dispossessed when the sin of the Amorites had reached its full measure. Genesis 15:16. If the pattern holds, and Scripture indicates it will, then the fulfillment of Paul's prophecy about moral collapse signals that other end times events are imminent. The stage is being set for the final act of history. This brings us to 2026. If 2025 showed us the death of empathy, 2026 threatens to plunge us into an even deeper spiritual darkness. Intelligence analysts and trend forecasters have identified 5 specific developments we should watch for. First, the emergence of synthetic empathy technology. As natural human empathy continues to decline, AI systems are being developed to simulate caring and emotional connection. By mid-2026, these systems will be sophisticated enough that many people will prefer them to actual human relationships. The irony is tragic. As we become less human, we create machines to remind us what humanity once was. Second, the normalization of recreational cruelty. Throughout 2025, we saw isolated incidents of violence committed purely for entertainment. In 2026, this behavior will begin to organize and systematize. Underground reality competitions involving genuine harm to willing participants have already begun in parts of Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. By mid-2026, these are projected to become global phenomena, streamed to millions of viewers. Third, the collapse of age-based protections. The special moral status of children, a cornerstone of civilization for millennia, is eroding rapidly. In 2025, we saw the first legal challenges to age of consent laws in several Western nations. By 2026, these challenges will multiply, using the language of autonomy and rights to mask what is essentially the normalization of predation. Fourth, the criminalization of traditional morality. What began as social disapproval of traditional moral values will increasingly be codified into law. By late 2026, expressing certain traditional moral positions will be classified as hate speech in many jurisdictions, carrying criminal penalties. The legal system, once based on Judeo-Christian moral foundations, will be weaponized against those same foundations. Fifth, the emergence of post-moral philosophical frameworks. Academic institutions are already developing ethical systems that explicitly reject the concept of universal moral truths. By 2026, these frameworks will move from theory to application, influencing law, medicine, education, and governance. The very idea that some actions are inherently wrong, regardless of context or consequence, will be treated as an outdated superstition. These developments aren't speculative. They're logical extensions of trends already in motion, and they align perfectly with Paul's prophetic warning about the character of the last days. But Paul doesn't leave us without hope. After describing this moral collapse, he continues in 2 Timothy 3:9. But they will not get very far, because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. This suggests that the moral inversion will eventually become so extreme, so obviously destructive, that its bankruptcy will become undeniable. We may be approaching that tipping point. As the consequences of moral collapse become increasingly severe, failed states, collapsed institutions, broken families, psychological devastation, the appeal of returning to traditional moral frameworks will grow. We're already seeing early signs of this counter-movement. Throughout 2025, amid the general moral decline, pockets of renewal emerged. In war-torn regions like Myanmar, underground churches grew at unprecedented rates. In Western universities, students began forming neo-traditional communities committed to classical virtues. In technology hubs, ethical tech movements gained momentum, rejecting the amoral approach that has dominated the industry. These may be the first stirrings of the Great Awakening that Scripture associates with the end times, not a return to cultural Christianity, but a genuine spiritual revival born from the recognition that human-centered moral systems ultimately fail. Jesus himself predicted this pattern in Matthew 24:12-14. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Notice the sequence. First, wickedness increases and love grows cold, exactly what we're witnessing. Then, despite this, or perhaps because of it, the gospel spreads globally. The very darkness of the times creates a hunger for light. This brings us to the most important question. How should we respond to the fulfillment of this prophecy? First, with sobriety. Paul's words to Timothy weren't just descriptive, they were prescriptive. After identifying the moral collapse, he advised, "Have nothing to do with such people." 2 Timothy chapter 3:5. This doesn't mean physical isolation, but moral distinction. As the culture embraces these destructive characteristics, believers must consciously reject them, living as visible alternatives. Second, with preparation. Jesus told his followers that when they saw the signs of the end, they should stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Luke 21:28. The fulfillment of prophecy isn't cause for fear, but for readiness, spiritual, mental, and practical preparation for the challenges ahead. Third, with compassion. The people exhibiting these terrible characteristics aren't the enemy, they're victims of deception. Paul notes that they are always learning, but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. 2 Timothy chapter 3:7. Our response should be pity, not condemnation, and a determination to offer the truth that can set them free. Fourth, with hope. The moral darkness Paul described isn't the end of the story. It's the darkness before dawn. The same scriptures that predict this collapse also promise Christ's return, the establishment of his kingdom, and the renewal of all things. As we enter 2026, the moral collapse will accelerate. The characteristics Paul identified will become even more pronounced. The inversion of values will become more complete. The consequences will become more severe. But remember, this isn't a random decline. It's a prophesied precursor to the greatest event in human history, the return of Christ. The darker the night grows, the closer we are to dawn. On January 15th, 2026, the World Economic Forum will host a special session titled Prophecy 3, Joel 2, Blood, Fire, and Columns of Smoke. If you thought the human cruelty unleashed during Myanmar's civil war was terrifying, what happened on March 28, 2025, revealed that even nature itself seems to have joined the conflict. At 9:43 in the morning, while the country was already bleeding from war, the earth roared. A massive 7.7 magnitude earthquake struck near Mandalay. It wasn't just a tremor, it was total devastation. The ground split open. Historic buildings crumbled like paper, and within minutes, the tragedy had its numbers. 45,500 people dead, and 30,000 homes reduced to rubble, with losses reaching $12 billion. But the most shocking part wasn't the earthquake itself. It was what came next. When the buildings collapsed, gas lines and electrical cables snapped. The old wooden houses turned into torches. Massive fires devoured Mandalay's central market, and for days, towering columns of black smoke rose into the sky, visible from miles away. They were so thick they blotted out the sun over a nation already living in darkness because of civil war. This is where prophecy stops being a metaphor and becomes a literal chronicle. The prophet Joel had warned about this centuries ago in Joel 2:30, chapter 31. "And I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire, and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes." Joel described 3 terrible signs, and Myanmar saw all of them fulfilled in a single day. 1. Blood. The blood shed by thousands of earthquake victims. 2. Fire. the uncontrollable fire that consumed the city. 3. Columns of smoke. Dense columns of smoke that darkened everything. The people trapped between the bombs of war and fire erupting from the earth had no idea they were living out a Bible verse in real time. Myanmar in 2025 became the exact setting for the judgments described by Joel. It was a convergence of disasters that sounded like a deafening alarm, a warning that the prophetic clock is about to strike midnight. But Myanmar wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout 2025, the world witnessed an unprecedented convergence of blood, fire, and smoke in multiple locations, each fulfilling Joel's prophecy with chilling precision. On April 17, 2025, the La Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent erupted with catastrophic force. Unlike its 2021 eruption, this one came with no warning. Pyroclastic flows, superheated clouds of gas, ash, and rock, swept down the mountainside at speeds exceeding 100 mph, incinerating everything in their path. Over 2,300 people perished, many of them literally vaporized by the 1,300-degree inferno. Survivors described rivers of fire flowing through villages and columns of smoke rising like towers into the sky. For weeks afterward, the sun appeared blood-red across the Caribbean due to volcanic particles in the atmosphere. May 22nd brought the Great Siberian Wildfires. After months of record-breaking heat and drought, lightning ignited the boreal forests of eastern Russia. Within days, an area larger than Belgium was ablaze. The smoke plume stretched over 1,200 miles, turning day to night across vast regions. Satellite images showed a smoke cloud so dense it appeared solid, like a gray continent floating above the earth. Russian authorities reported 1,700 deaths, but independent experts believe the true toll exceeded 5,000, with many victims found in their vehicles, trapped while trying to escape. June 30th saw the Taiwan Strait tsunami. A submarine landslide triggered a massive wave that struck the island's western coast with almost no warning. Keelung and Taichung were hardest hit, with water reaching nearly a mile inland. The official death toll reached 14,300, with thousands more missing. But the disaster's most striking feature came afterward. The tsunami had ruptured chemical storage facilities along Taiwan's industrial coast. Toxic fires burned for weeks, sending columns of black smoke into the sky that were visible from mainland China. The smoke was so thick that streetlights remained on at midday in Taipei. On August 8th, the Amazon basin firestorm began what would become the most destructive wildfire in recorded history. Unlike previous Amazon fires, which spread relatively slowly, this one created its own weather system. A genuine fire tornado with winds exceeding 100 miles. The resulting inferno consumed over 7 million acres in just 12 days. Indigenous communities with no means of escape suffered catastrophic losses. The smoke plume was so vast it circled the globe, creating eerie red sunsets as far away as Australia and Europe. Scientists estimated that over 1 billion animals perished in the flames. September 19th brought the Kamchatka eruption. Russia's Klyuchevskaya Sopka volcano produced the largest eruption of the 21st century, ejecting more than 30 cubic kilometers of material, 10 times that of Mount St. Helens in 1980. The ash column reached 45 kilometers into the stratosphere. While the remote location limited human casualties to under 1,000, the global impact was profound. Average temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped 1.2 degrees Celsius as sunlight was blocked by volcanic particles. Farmers across Russia, Canada, and northern Europe reported crop failures as summer temperatures remained abnormally low. On October 24th, the San Andreas Fault finally gave way. The long-predicted Big One struck California with a magnitude of 8.4, the strongest earthquake in North American history. Los Angeles and San Francisco suffered catastrophic damage, but it was the secondary effects that truly fulfilled the prophecy. Ruptured gas lines ignited thousands of fires simultaneously, With water mains broken and emergency services overwhelmed, many of these fires burned unchecked for days. The death toll reached 32,000, with economic losses exceeding $1 trillion. Smoke from the urban firestorm was so dense that midday in the Central Valley resembled midnight. NASA images showed a smoke plume stretching from Baja California to Oregon, a literal column of smoke 1,200 miles long. November 12th saw the Arabian Peninsula dust storm, the most severe ever recorded. A combination of drought, desertification, and unusual wind patterns created a wall of dust over 2 miles high that swept across Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and the UAE. Riyadh disappeared beneath an orange-brown cloud so thick that breathing outdoors became impossible. Over 3,500 people died from respiratory failure or accidents in zero-visibility conditions. The sun vanished for 3 days. When it finally reappeared, it glowed an unearthly red through the lingering dust. A blood-red sun exactly as Joel described. On December 5th, the North Sea methane blowout occurred when an offshore drilling platform struck an unexpected pocket of gas. The resulting explosion killed all 147 workers instantly. But the true horror came after. The ruptured seabed began releasing massive amounts of methane, which ignited on the surface. The resulting fire covered nearly 8 square miles of ocean, a literal sea of flame that burned for 23 days before engineers could cap the leak. The smoke column was visible from space, and northern European cities reported black rain as particulates were carried inland by winter storms. 8 major disasters, 8 literal manifestations of blood, fire, and columns of smoke. 8 fulfillments of Joel's prophecy in a single year. This isn't a coincidence, it's confirmation. But Joel's prophecy contains another element that's crucial for understanding our place in prophetic history. He says, "These signs will appear before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes." In biblical language, the day of the Lord refers to God's direct intervention in human affairs, His judgment, and the establishment of His kingdom. Joel is telling us that these disasters aren't random. They're harbingers, warning signs that God's final judgment approaches. They're the cosmic equivalent of thunder before the storm, tremors before the earthquake. And if 2025 brought these harbingers with unprecedented frequency and intensity, what does that tell us about 2026? The pattern suggests acceleration. Throughout Scripture, prophetic fulfillments tend to intensify as they approach their climax. Jesus used the metaphor of birth pangs, contractions that grow stronger and closer together as delivery approaches. If 2025 represented early labor, 2026 may bring transition, the most intense phase before birth. Geological and meteorological data support this projection. The cascading effects of climate change have created conditions ripe for more frequent and severe natural disasters. Seismic activity along the Pacific Ring of Fire increased 43% in 2025, compared to the previous decade average. Atmospheric methane levels reached a new record in December 2025, trapping more heat and destabilizing weather patterns. But there's a deeper dimension to Joel's prophecy that goes beyond natural disasters. The prophet links these physical signs to spiritual realities. Just before describing the blood, fire, and smoke, Joel writes, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants in those days I will pour out my spirit." This passage describes a great spiritual awakening, a supernatural outpouring that coincides with the natural disasters. And remarkably, we're seeing signs of this as well. Throughout 2025, amid the catastrophes, reports emerged of unprecedented spiritual phenomena. In the refugee camps housing survivors of the Myanmar earthquake, Christian aid workers documented thousands of conversions. Many refugees reported having dreams of Jesus before ever hearing the gospel message. Similar accounts came from disaster zones in California, Taiwan, and Saudi Arabia. In regions untouched by disaster, spiritual hunger also intensified. Church attendance in the United States, which had been declining for decades, suddenly reversed course in mid-2025. By December, many congregations reported standing room only at services. Campus ministries saw participation rates triple at universities that had long been bastions of secularism. Even more striking were the reports of supernatural manifestations. In Brazil, following the Amazon firestorm, hundreds of documented healings occurred during prayer gatherings. In South Korea, a revival movement that began in Seoul in September spread to every major city by year's end, with participants reporting prophetic visions and speaking in languages they had never learned. These phenomena aren't limited to Christianity. Jewish communities worldwide reported a surge in interest in messianic prophecies. Islamic scholars in several countries publicly questioned traditional interpretations of end-times texts. Hindu and Buddhist leaders spoke of unusual spiritual experiences that defied their traditional frameworks. This global spiritual stirring alongside natural disasters aligns perfectly with Joel's prophecy, the outpouring of God's Spirit concurrent with signs in nature. But there's a third element in Joel's prophecy that demands our attention. After describing both the spiritual outpouring and the natural signs, he continues, "And I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." That final line reveals the purpose behind these signs: salvation. The disasters and spiritual awakening aren't ends in themselves. They're God's final call to humanity before judgment falls. They're His way of saying, "Wake up! Time is short. Return to me while you still can." This understanding transforms how we view the catastrophes of 2025. They weren't just natural disasters. They were divine megaphones, God shouting to a world that has stopped listening to His whispers. And if that's true, what does it tell us about 2026? 5 specific developments bear watching as we enter the new year. First, watch for disasters that defy scientific explanation. The events of 2025, while extreme, could still be classified within known natural phenomena. But Joel's prophecy suggests that as the day of the Lord approaches, we'll see wonders, occurrences that break natural laws and leave experts baffled. The first such incident may have already occurred on December 28, 2025, when seismographs worldwide detected what appeared to be a magnitude 9.7 earthquake. Yet no surface damage was reported anywhere. Scientists still have no explanation for this phantom quake. Second, watch for convergent disasters, multiple catastrophes striking simultaneously in ways that multiply their impact. The Myanmar earthquake, coinciding with civil war, was an early example. Intelligence agencies have war-gamed scenarios where pandemic, earthquake, and cyber attack occur simultaneously, overwhelming response capabilities. Such convergences become increasingly likely as individual disaster frequencies rise. Third, watch for the normalization of the apocalyptic. Human psychology adapts quickly. Events that would have dominated headlines for months in previous decades now receive days or hours of attention before the next crisis takes center stage. This psychological numbing is itself prophetically significant. Jesus warned that in the end times, people would be eating and drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage right up until judgment falls, oblivious to the signs around them. Fourth, watch for unprecedented cosmic phenomena. Joel specifically mentions the sun turning to darkness and the moon to blood. While volcanic eruptions and dust storms can create these effects locally, as we saw in 2025, the prophecy suggests something more dramatic and widespread. Astronomical anomalies, solar events, or phenomena in near-Earth space could fulfill this aspect of the prophecy in 2026. Fifth, watch for the spiritual divide to deepen. As Joel's prophecy unfolds, humanity increasingly separates into two groups: those who call on the name of the Lord and those who don't. This polarization accelerated throughout 2025 and will likely intensify in 2026. The middle ground is disappearing. Nominal religious affiliation is giving way to either genuine commitment or outright rejection. These developments aren't just interesting possibilities, they're prophetic certainties. The only questions are timing and sequence. As we've seen, Joel's prophecy connects directly to the end times and Christ's return. The Apostle Peter quoted this very passage on the day of Pentecost, declaring that the outpouring of God's Spirit marked the beginning of the last days. 2,000 years later, we're seeing the culmination of what began then, the final fulfillment of Joel's words before Christ's return. This brings us to a crucial insight about 2026. If the blood, fire, and columns of smoke of 2025 were fulfilling Joel's prophecy about the signs before the great and awesome day of the Lord, then 2026 may bring us to the threshold of that day itself. What would that look like? Scripture gives us clear indicators. Jesus said in Matthew 24:29-30, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." The Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord." The Apostle John recorded in Revelation 7, "Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all tribes of the earth will wail on account of him." These passages describe the most dramatic event in human history, the physical return of Christ to earth. And Joel's prophecy tells us that the blood, fire, and columns of smoke we witnessed in 2025 are direct precursors to this event. Does that mean Christ will return in 2026? No one knows the day or hour. Jesus himself said in Matthew 24:36, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." But Jesus also commanded us to recognize the signs of the times. In Luke 21:28, after describing the very events we're witnessing, he said, "Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." The blood, fire, and columns of smoke have appeared exactly as Joel prophesied. The spiritual awakening he predicted is unfolding before our eyes. The sun has been darkened, and the moon turned to blood through natural disasters that defy historical precedent. Myanmar in 2025 wasn't just a humanitarian tragedy. It was a prophetic milestone, a convergence of biblical signs that marks our place on God's timeline. And as we enter 2026, the convergence will only intensify. The prophet Joel saw our day. He described our headlines. He warned us that these signs would immediately precede the great and awesome day of the Lord. And now we've seen those signs with our own eyes. The question isn't whether Joel's prophecy is being fulfilled. The evidence is overwhelming that it is. The question is whether we're paying attention, whether we recognize the divine warning in the blood, fire, and columns of smoke. As we move into 2026, these signs will become impossible to ignore. The only question is how we'll respond to them. Will we be like Noah's contemporaries, who continued business as usual until the flood swept them away? Or will we be like those who call on the name of the Lord and find salvation even as judgment falls. The blood, fire, and columns of smoke aren't just disasters. They're invitations, God's final call to return to Him before the day of reckoning arrives. And based on prophecy to Luke 21, the roaring of the seas. On March 12, 2025, Australia's east coast stopped being a paradise and turned into a scene straight out of Revelation. The culprit was Cyclone Alfred, a Category 4 monster. But it didn't just bring 140 mph winds, it brought the ocean with it. A 26-foot wall of water slammed into the coast. Within hours, the streets of Townsville weren't streets anymore. They were rivers 10 feet deep. Meanwhile, the Hawkesbury River in Sydney rose 43 feet, sweeping away cars, livestock, and entire homes in the worst flooding seen in 50 years. But the moment that made everyone's blood run cold happened in Cairns. The flooding was so extreme that crocodiles forced out of their habitat started swimming through residential streets. They were spotted lurking among the debris. The entire nation came to a standstill. Suddenly, Australia, a rich and powerful country, was forced to declare a national emergency and desperately call on New Zealand and the United States for help. The world watched in shock as one of the great Western powers literally struggled to breathe underwater. What's most unsettling is that survivors described the sound of waves crashing against buildings not as the noise of water, but as continuous thunder, a deafening roar. And that word roar is exactly what Jesus used to describe one of the signs of the end. In Luke 21, 25, 26, Jesus said, "And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken." Pay close attention to the two parts of this prophecy. First, the sea and the waves roaring. Witnesses didn't use any other word. They literally heard the ocean roar as it devoured the coastline. Second, distress of nations with perplexity. We saw the absolute helplessness of a modern government, bewildered and overwhelmed by nature's fury. What happened with Cyclone Alfred wasn't just a weather event, it was the Bible unfolding in real time. The sea roared and brought destruction exactly as it was written. But Australia wasn't alone. Throughout 2025, coastlines around the world experienced unprecedented maritime disasters, each one fulfilling Jesus' prophecy with chilling precision. On April 18, 2025, the North Sea megastorm struck northern Europe with a ferocity that shattered all historical records. Wind speeds reached 165 mph, hurricane strength in a region that rarely sees tropical-style storms. The resulting storm surge overwhelmed sea defenses designed to last a century. Amsterdam's elaborate flood control systems, considered among the world's most advanced, failed catastrophically. 30% of the Netherlands disappeared underwater in less than 6 hours. Hamburg, Bremen, and Copenhagen suffered similar fates. The death toll reached 4,700, with economic losses exceeding $300 billion. Survivors consistently described the sound of the approaching water as a roar like 1,000 freight trains, the exact terminology Jesus used 2,000 years ago. June 7th brought the Bay of Bengal tsunami, triggered by a submarine landslide rather than an earthquake, giving coastal communities in India and Bangladesh virtually no warning. The wave reached 18 meters in some locations, penetrating up to 5 kilometers inland. Kolkata's port facilities were obliterated. Over 230,000 people perished, the deadliest tsunami since the 2004 Indian Ocean disaster. Most haunting were recordings captured on survivors' phones. The unmistakable roar of the approaching wall of water, a sound so primal it triggered instinctive terror, even in those who had never experienced a tsunami before. On August 22nd, Hurricane Ophelia became the first Category 6 storm in recorded history. Meteorologists had to create this new classification when Ophelia's sustained winds exceeded 100 mph, beyond the upper limit of the traditional Saffir-Simpson scale. The storm made landfall near Miami with winds still at 185 mph, generating a storm surge that reached the third floor of downtown buildings. For the first time in American history, an entire major city was deemed temporarily uninhabitable by FEMA. The evacuation of Miami's 6 million residents became the largest population movement in U.S. history. The roar of Ophelia was so intense that seismographs registered it as equivalent to a magnitude 4.2 earthquake, sound waves literally shaking the earth. October 5th saw the Mediterranean meteotsunami, rare phenomenon where atmospheric pressure changes, not seismic activity, generate tsunami-like waves. What made this event unprecedented was its scale. Normal meteotsunamis produce waves of 1–2 meters. This one generated waves up to 8 meters high that struck the coasts of Spain, France, and Italy simultaneously. The tourist-filled beaches of the Côte d'Azur and Costa del Sol became death traps. Over 3,800 people perished, many of them vacationers enjoying the autumn sunshine one moment and swept out to sea the next. Witnesses described a sound like the sky was being torn open as the waves approached, another vivid fulfillment of the roaring seas Jesus prophesied. On November 17th, the Antarctic ice shelf collapse accelerated beyond scientists' worst predictions. A section of the Thwaites Glacier, larger than Rhode Island, broke free in a single event, generating waves that radiated across the Southern Ocean. While the immediate human impact was limited due to the remote location, the long-term consequences were profound. Global sea levels rose 3.7 centimeters in a single day, an unprecedented spike that caused flooding in low-lying coastal areas worldwide. More ominously, the collapse triggered changes in ocean currents that meteorologists predict will intensify coastal storms globally for years to come. The sound of the ice shelf breaking away was recorded by research stations 300 miles distant, a deep, thunderous roar that one scientist described as the voice of a changing planet. December 24th brought a grim Christmas Eve to Japan, when the Nankai Trough finally produced the megathrust earthquake seismologists had feared for decades. The magnitude 9.1 quake generated a tsunami that overwhelmed even Japan's sophisticated defenses. Waves exceeding 20 meters struck the southern coast of Honshu, with some reaching as far as 10 kilometers inland. Despite advanced warning systems and regular drills, over 18,000 people perished. The economic impact was global. The port of Nagoya, which handles 10% of Japan's trade, was destroyed, triggering supply chain disruptions worldwide. Survivors described the approaching tsunami not as a wave, but as the ocean itself rising up with a roar that could be heard even over the earthquake's rumble. 6 major disasters, 6 coastlines, 6 fulfillments of Jesus' prophecy about the sea and the waves roaring. But there's another dimension to this prophecy that's equally important. Jesus didn't just predict roaring seas. He described their psychological impact, men's hearts failing them from fear, and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. This heart-stopping fear became a global phenomenon in 2025. Climate anxiety, once limited to environmentalists and scientists, spread to the general population as maritime disasters dominated headlines. Coastal property values collapsed worldwide as insurance companies withdrew coverage from high-risk shorelines, a category that expanded with each new disaster. A Gallup poll in October 2025 found that 78% of respondents worldwide believed catastrophic climate events will significantly impact my life within 5 years, up from 31% in 2020. Mental health professionals reported unprecedented levels of environmental dread, particularly among young people. This collective fear is exactly what Jesus predicted. Not just physical disasters, but psychological collapse in their wake. The Greek phrase translated as hearts failing literally means breathing out, a vivid description of the panic attacks and anxiety disorders that surged throughout 2025. But Jesus didn't share this prophecy to terrify us. He gave it as a sign, a cosmic timestamp, to help us recognize where we are in God's timeline. Immediately after describing these disasters, he adds in Luke chapter 21:28, "Now, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near." The roaring seas aren't just disasters, they're announcements. They're heaven's way of saying, pay attention, the King is coming. And if the seas roared in 2025 as never before, what does that tell us about 2020? Oceanographers and climate scientists project that maritime disasters will only intensify. The thermal energy absorbed by oceans continues to rise, fueling stronger storms. Sea levels continue their steady climb, making each storm surge more destructive than the last. Ocean acidification weakens marine ecosystems, removing natural buffers against coastal erosion. But beyond these scientific projections lies the prophetic certainty. Jesus said these signs would increase as his return approaches. The roaring seas of 2025 were harbingers. The roaring seas of 2026 will be heralds. As we enter the new year, 5 specific developments bear watching. First, the emergence of compound coastal events, multiple maritime threats converging simultaneously. Models suggest the first such event could strike Southeast Asia in early 2026, combining typhoon, tsunami risk, and record high tides. Second, the collapse of coastal insurance markets globally. Lloyd's of London, the world's oldest insurance market, announced in December 2025 that it would no longer underwrite policies for properties less than 3 meters above sea level, effectively abandoning thousands of coastal communities to financial ruin when disasters strike. Third, the acceleration of climate refugees from coastal regions. The UN projects that over 8 million people will be displaced by rising seas and coastal disasters in 2026 alone, creating humanitarian crises and political tensions as nations struggle to absorb these populations. Fourth, the failure of additional coastal defense systems designed for previous climate conditions. Rotterdam's massive Maaslandkering barrier, designed to protect the city for 200 years, is now projected to be inadequate by mid-2026 if current trends continue. Fifth, the psychological tipping point as coastal living, historically desirable across human civilization, becomes widely perceived as untenable. Property values in Miami have already fallen 68% since Hurricane Ophelia. Similar collapses are projected for other vulnerable coastal cities in 2026. These aren't just trends. They're fulfillments of Jesus' words about roaring seas and failing hearts. They're signposts on the road to his return. And if this is just one of the 10 prophecies converging in our time, imagine what it means when we consider them together. The seas are roaring. The nations are raging. The earth itself is convulsing. Every sign points to the same conclusion. Christ's return is imminent. But there's one final prophecy, perhaps the most significant of all, that brings everything into focus. A prophecy about the kings of the East and their march toward Armageddon. Prophecy 1. Revelation 16. The Kings of the East. On May 22, 2025, the sound of crunching metal in the South China Sea put the whole world on alert. This wasn't a simple navigation error, it was a deliberate act. A Chinese vessel intentionally ramming a Filipino boat at Sandy Cay Reef. But this collision wasn't an isolated incident. China wasn't just striking a boat, it was responding to what had happened just days earlier. Between April and May, the United States and the Philippines had launched Operation Balikatan, a massive military exercise involving 14,000 troops, anti-ship missiles, and joint patrols with Japan and Australia. For military analysts, this is a struggle for control of the ocean. For students of biblical prophecy, it's preparation for Armageddon. The Bible describes with astonishing precision the final movement of Asia's armies. Listen to what the book of Revelation says in chapter 16, verses 12 to 14. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Then I saw three impure spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are demonic spirits that perform signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. Notice the imagery here. The text speaks of removing a barrier, of drying up a river so the kings from the east have a clear path to advance. In biblical times, the great Euphrates River was the physical barrier that held back invading empires from the east. Today in our world, that barrier is no longer a river. It's the strategic sea routes controlled by the West. What China is doing by aggressively securing the South China Sea and challenging Western powers is exactly that. It's drying up the river. As the great king of the East in our time, China is clearing its path, securing the vital routes it will need to move its troops and resources toward a global conflict. That's why the military exercises and clashes of 2025 weren't just minor skirmishes. They were prophecy unfolding right before our eyes. The path is drying up, the route is opening, and everything is being set in motion for the kings of the East to begin their march. But China isn't acting alone. Throughout 2025, we witnessed the formation of what military strategists call the Eastern Alliance, a coalition that aligns perfectly with biblical prophecy about the kings of the East. On June 15, 2025, China and Russia conducted their largest ever joint naval exercise in the Western Pacific. Over 60 ships, including both countries' aircraft carriers, participated in war games explicitly designed to simulate breaking through the first island chain, the string of U.S. allied nations that has historically contained China's maritime ambitions. The message was unmistakable. The two great powers of the East were uniting their military capabilities. July brought the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tehran, a gathering that expanded this Eastern Bloc. For the first time, Iran was elevated to full membership, creating a continuous band of allied nations stretching from the South China Sea to the Mediterranean. The summit concluded with the signing of the Eastern Strategic Partnership, a mutual defense pact binding China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and several Central Asian states. On August 23rd, North Korea joined this alliance through a separate bilateral agreement with China. In exchange for economic support, Pyongyang granted Beijing access to its ports for military purposes, effectively extending China's naval reach to the Sea of Japan. South Korean intelligence reported Chinese technical advisors arriving at North Korean missile facilities within days of the agreement. September saw the alliance extend into Southeast Asia, when Myanmar's military junta, isolated by Western sanctions and desperate for support, signed a 99-year lease giving China control of the deep-water port at Gyeongju. This strategic location provides China direct access to the Indian Ocean, bypassing the Malacca Strait, a potential choke point controlled by U.S. allies. By October, the alliance had reached Africa. China's military base in Djibouti was expanded to accommodate Russian naval vessels, while both powers increased their presence in Sudan following the collapse of the transitional government. These moves secured access to the Red Sea and positioned Chinese and Russian forces within striking distance of the Suez Canal. November brought the most alarming development yet: the Technological Sovereignty Accord signed by all Eastern Alliance members. This agreement pooled research in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic weapons, and space technology. Western intelligence agencies estimated this collaboration could accelerate Chinese military capabilities by 5 to 7 years, potentially overtaking U.S. advantages in critical domains by 2027. The year concluded with December's Belt and Road Security Conference in Beijing, where alliance members unveiled a unified command structure for joint military operations. This unprecedented integration created what NATO analysts described as a coherent Eastern Bloc with global power projection capabilities. In biblical terms, the kings of the East united and ready to march. This alliance isn't forming by accident. It's the fulfillment of prophecy written nearly 2,000 years ago. John saw the kings of the East gathering for the final battle, and in 2025, we watched them sign the treaties and conduct the exercises that will make that gathering possible. But Revelation doesn't just tell us about the kings of the East. It tells us where they're heading, to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. The next verse specifies the location. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Armageddon isn't a metaphor. It's a real place. Jerusalem, the hill of Megiddo in northern Israel, overlooking the Jezreel Valley. This vast plain has been a battlefield throughout history, from ancient Egyptian campaigns to Napoleon's exploits. Military strategists call it the perfect battlefield because of its flat terrain and strategic location at the crossroads of three continents. And remarkably, this very location became a focus of geopolitical tension in 2025. On July 7th, Israeli intelligence detected Iranian-backed forces establishing positions in southern Syria, less than 60 miles from Megiddo. Prime Minister Netanyahu warned that Israel would not tolerate hostile forces so close to its northern border. The United States reinforced its presence in the region, deploying the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Group to the eastern Mediterranean. By September, Russian military advisors had joined these Iranian proxies, ostensibly to prevent conflict, but effectively creating a tripwire that would draw Russia into any Israeli strike. Satellite imagery revealed sophisticated air defense systems being installed, systems that could only have come from Russia or China. In October, China made its first direct entry into this volatile mix. Using its growing influence in Lebanon following that country's economic collapse, Beijing established a commercial maritime facility in Tripoli, less than 100 miles from Israel's northern border. Western intelligence agencies confirmed that Chinese military personnel were operating at the site under civilian cover. By December, the pieces were in place. Three of the world's great powers, China, Russia, and Iran, had established military presence within striking distance of Armageddon. The kings of the East weren't just forming an alliance. They were physically positioning themselves exactly where Revelation said they would gather for the final battle. This convergence of prophetic fulfillment is unprecedented. We're not just seeing vague patterns that could be interpreted as matching Scripture. We're seeing specific developments: the Eastern Alliance, the securing of maritime routes, the military positioning near Megiddo that align precisely with Revelation's description of the end-time scenario. And if these developments accelerated throughout 2025, what does that tell us about 2026? Military analysts project 5 specific developments that align perfectly with biblical prophecy. First, the consolidation of the Eastern Alliance through integrated command structures and joint military exercises. Intelligence reports indicate planning for Eastern Shield 2026, the largest multinational military exercise in history, involving forces from all alliance members operating under unified command. Second, the continued erosion of Western influence in strategic waterways. China's naval expansion and diplomatic efforts are systematically challenging U.S. control of key maritime choke points, from the Strait of Malacca to the Bab el-Mandeb. This is the modern equivalent of the Euphrates drying up to prepare the way for the kings of the East. Third, the acceleration of military technology transfer within the alliance. The Technological Sovereignty Accord is already bearing fruit, with Chinese AI systems enhancing Russian weapons platforms and Iranian drone technology being integrated into Chinese naval vessels. By mid-2026, This collaboration could produce capabilities that no single nation could develop alone. Fourth, the expansion of alliance infrastructure in the Middle East. Construction has already begun on a Chinese-funded deep-water port in Syria, less than 200 miles from Israel. Russian aerospace facilities in Iran are being enlarged to accommodate strategic bombers. These developments place alliance military power ever closer to Armageddon. Fifth, the triggering incident that prophecy suggests will ultimately draw these forces into direct conflict. While we can't predict the exact nature of this trigger, tensions surrounding Jerusalem, Iran's nuclear program, or competition for Eastern Mediterranean energy resources all provide potential flashpoints. These aren't speculative scenarios. They're the logical progression of developments already underway, developments that align with remarkable precision to Revelation's prophecy about the kings of the East. As we enter 2026, the march toward Armageddon continues. The kings of the East are gathering. The barriers that once held them back are being removed. The ancient prophecy is unfolding before our eyes. But this isn't the end of the story. Revelation doesn't just tell us about the gathering at Armageddon. It tells us about Christ's triumphant return, his victory over these gathered forces, and the establishment of his kingdom. That's the ultimate fulfillment toward which all these prophecies point. The kings of the East aren't gathering by chance. They're being drawn into position for the final act of human history, the return of the King of Kings. And if the first part of the prophecy is being fulfilled with such precision, we can have absolute confidence that the second part will be fulfilled as well. Christ is coming. His return is imminent. And every headline about China, Russia, and the Middle East brings us one step closer to that glorious day. The kings of the East are on the march. Armageddon awaits, but so does the triumph of our returning Lord. Behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me, to render to every man according to what he has done. These words from Revelation 22:12 have echoed through centuries, but never have they resonated with such clarity as they do today. The ancient prophets weren't just speaking to their time, they were speaking to ours. In 2025, we've witnessed the precise fulfillment of prophecies written millennia ago. The siege of Jerusalem, the roaring of the seas, the kings of the East preparing for war. These aren't coincidences. They're divine coordinates on God's prophetic timeline. I've spent decades studying these patterns, and what I've discovered about 2026 will shake you to your core. 10 biblical prophecies are converging next year with mathematical precision. The cosmic clock is about to strike midnight, and most people have no idea what's coming. Look around you. The world is changing at a pace that defies